very pleased to welcome Celso Neto from, is it Dalhousie you say that?
Yes.
I don't know how to say Dalhousie University, who's going to talk to us about what is it that evolves. Okay, over to you.
Thank you very much for having me. And it's great. It's really great to be here because I think my postdoc at Dalhousie connects in interesting ways to the work that your group is doing. So the talk I'm giving today started actually as a collaboration with Ford Doolittle, my supervisor in this postdoc. And we are part of this group that we call the Evolutionary Gaia group. So we have a set of biologists and philosophers and mathematicians trying to make sense of how evolution can happen in hard cases. So hard cases are they involve complex systems such as microbial communities and even biochemical cycles. So, and because of this interest in these hard cases, notions such as emergence, such as function, such as supervenience and levels are pretty important to us as they are for your group. So one example of a hard case I mentioned are microbial communities. So in our gut bacteria is one example of such communities, and they have tightly complex adaptations. So these bacterial communities seem to behave just like an organism. They have really complex behaviors, but of course, it's hard to make sense of how these communities as a whole can reproduce and transmit their traits. So it's unclear how selection applies to those communities. So it is the case that a community as a whole is under selection, or perhaps the components of those communities are being selected, but not the communities as a whole. So these types of discussions are pretty much heated, giving rise to a heated debate that has persisted for decades. And this debate is about two central questions regarding natural selection. So here you have a bunch of pictures from people who have been engaging in this debate. You have George Williams in the 60s, and you have more recent people like Peter Godfrey Smith or Lisa Lloyd in recent years. So two fundamental questions about natural selection are the following. First, what are the basic conditions for selection to occur? So do we need reproduction? Do we need competition? What do we need? Second question is, what types of entities and levels can be involved in selection? So can we talk about selection of genes, but maybe also selection of species? So those are the questions that have been occupied the concern of philosophers and scientists for decades, and rightly so. So in this talk, I will discuss an idea that I see widespread in this debate. So different definitions of natural selection assume a common idea. And the idea is that lineages are units of evolution. So here's the idea. Evolution occurs by natural selection because we have entities that produce more of themselves. So here you see a set of arrows and dots. So you can think of this as a diagram with dots, black dots as males and white dots as females, or vice versa. And they combine, they reproduce and generate more dots. Over time, these dots are forming sequences of parent-offspring relations. And they are changing over time. So the traits of parents are passed on to the offspring, and new changes occur, and those changes are passed again to the offspring. So we have a sequence of individuals, of dots here, that are changing over time. And at a certain point, some event might happen, and the lineage here, so the sequence of dots, can split. So this is a common understanding of how evolution by natural selection is occurring. And I will go deep into this idea in a bit. But what I want to do is actually to challenge and to reconceive this idea in a way that is instructive for us to understand cases, hard cases, such as the microbial communities. So the plan of this talk is really to start with this idea that I mentioned, lineages as units of evolution. Then I will discuss some hard cases, in the sense that are cases where reproduction and inheritance are very unclear. So it might be unclear what counts as a parent and what counts as an offspring. And from those cases, I will argue that we should distinguish these two concepts, lineage and units of evolution. And after doing this distinction, I will provide some reasons why this distinction is beneficial. Okay, so just a sip of water. So remember all those faces, all those scholars that discuss what is natural selection. Well, they can be divided into two categories. There are basically two traditional approaches, two different ways to define how evolution by natural selection occurs. And now I show that both of them agree on the idea that lineages are units of evolution. So the first way to define natural selection came with Richard Dawkins and was developed further by Dave Hall. So this is the so-called replicator approach. So according to it, natural selection is a process involving the interplay between two different types of entities. So we have one type of entity is the replicator, an entity that replicates, that produces another almost identical copy of itself. And one example here are the genes. But the genes do not evolve alone. Genes need interactors. So interactors are entities that interact, that engage with the environment. And depending on this engagement with the environment, its replicators will be spread or not. So the example here of an interactor is an organism, right? So I, as an organism, I have genes, and if I'm successful in the environment, I will pass my genes along. If I'm not successful, I will not pass them along. And my genes are important because it's in virtue, partly in virtue of my genes, that I have the traits, the properties that I have, and those properties are the ones that matter if I will be successful in the environment. So there is this interplay between genes and organisms, between replicators and interactors. According to Dave Hall, there is a third type of entity in the process of evolution. So we have replicators, we have interactors, and we have something that results from these two entities. So according to him, replicators and interactors are the entities that function in the evolutionary process. But other entities evolve as a result of this process. So, and this entity that evolves as a result is the unit of evolution. It is something that is able to change indefinitely, something that persists through time in a way that it can change indefinitely as a result of containing replicators and interactors. So lineages are the best candidate for being such persisting entities here, because they are simply sequences of replicators and interactors. So think back again on this diagram that you see. We have the dots, and these dots, we can understand these dots as organisms, sexual organisms, as I said. So we have males and females reproduce. Those males and females form lineages, and in virtue of this, they pass on their genes. Their genes mutate, change over time, and as a result, the lineage will accumulate changes, and it will display, it will exhibit, it will perform, it will show over time a change in traits, right? We can think, for example, that in the beginning of the evolutionary dynamic of the population, of the group that you see here, let's imagine that there is something resembling an eye here in these dots. As evolution progresses, as small changes are being accumulated over time, something complex as the human eye can show up. So here, again, the idea is that what evolves as a result of selection, so selection is acting on replicators or interactors, and as a result, what's really changing is something that persists over time. It's a sequence of parent-offspring entities. Now, a similar idea shows up in a very different definition of natural selection. So this definition of natural selection is called the Lewontin recipe, because of Richard Lewontin, and more recently, Peter Godfrey Smith also fleshed out this recipe. According to this definition of selection, we don't talk about replicators or interactors at all. We talk about individuals. So individuals in a population vary in their physical traits. Those traits will influence the survival and reproduction of those individuals. And moreover, individuals will tend to pass on those variations for future generations. So there is a correlation between parent and offspring. This correlation is based on the fact that I tend to be similar to my parents. And because of that, if my parents are successful in reproducing and surviving, I will likely be successful as well if the environment remains the same. So here again, with this Lewontin recipe, we have the idea that individuals are forming lineages that exhibit and accumulate successful traits over time. So let me break down, before moving on, let me break down this idea of lineages as units of evolution. So both ways to define natural selection are assuming that there are entities such as replicators, interactors, or simply individuals that form discrete parent-offspring sequences. Parents will causally and directly influence the material origin of the offspring. Parents will therefore causally influence the traits that the offspring will have. Here's a drawing from a paper from Peter Godfrey Smith, where these ideas are represented in terms of the human reproduction, but this pretty much generalized to mammal reproduction, where we have sexual organisms producing gametes that then will lead to an egg, and will lead then further to a completely new individual with a different set of genetic components, right? That are a mix of parents, right? So here we have discrete generations, and we have this causal influence from parent to the offspring. Going to a very different domain of life, bacteria, asexual reproduction. You also have bacteria dividing themselves and parents causally influencing the traits and the origin of the offspring. So the key point is that because we have this chain of parent-offspring, we have traits that are reappearing generation over generation, and therefore they can accumulate over time. So this is the central idea of lineages as units of evolution. And for the remaining of my time, I will expand this idea. I will say that the category of units of evolution is broader, is bigger than the category of lineages. I say that lineages are not only units of evolution, they also do something else in natural selection sometimes. And then I will say that units of evolution are not necessarily this discrete parent-offspring lineages, and they are best conceptualized as a type of first-order Markov chain. Okay, let me present some cases to motivate the claims that I will make. So the first case is Pendle. So Pendle is a set of aspen trees that exist in the Fish Lake National Park in Utah. And what is interesting about this set of trees is that they are all interconnected underneath through their root system. And so these trees are, of course, distinct physiological units. We can distinguish them in terms of the trunk and the leaves, etc. But at the same time, they are one genetic entity because they are clones of each other. So these two characteristics are very interesting because it creates a different dynamic when selection is occurring. So the trees here, they contribute to the persistence of the grove as a whole. So each tree is being favored by selection in terms of how it helps the set of trees to persist, to keep persisting. For instance, these trees, they reallocate nutrients from certain parts of the group to another. They can do this easily. And by doing this, they actually are favoring, they are preserving the existence of the grove as a whole. So, another interesting characteristic is that because the trees are connected, it's easier for the trees to occupy dense areas. So there is an advantage for the trees to be connected. And by being connected and occupying dense areas, they are actually contributing to the growth as a whole, because then the growth as a whole will expand its geographical range. So what I'm saying here is that this is a case where, first of all, the distinction between growth and reproduction is a little bit messy, because the physiological units are interconnected and they are clones of each other. And furthermore, this set of trees, they compete against other set of trees. So Pendle will compete or will do better than other Pendle type communities in terms of traits such as geographical range. So these are characteristics of the lineage as a whole. And this characteristic is being selected. So it is advantageous for the trees to develop this expansion of the geographical range. So I will come back to this point, but this is to drive the message that lineages are actually, in a case like this, they function analogously to an organism, right? So now a second type of borderline case, retrovirus. As we know, retroviruses replicate by using necessarily the machinery that is existent in cells. So they have to get into a cell and use its reverse transcription mechanisms to generate an identical copy of the virus. So this is a case where the notion of what is the parent in a lineage is a little is not as clear as cases like human reproduction or bacteria, right? Because here we have reproduction. The cell is producing more of it. Sorry, the retrovirus is producing more of itself, but in a way that is mediated. It's really rely on external mechanisms. So, for instance, because of this reliance on external mechanisms, the parent virus, what you could call the parent virus, does not share matter with the offspring virus. So there is no propagule, there is no egg, there is no gamete that is combined, or there is no piece of matter that flows from parent to offspring. So some people want to say, well, this is still reproduction. Other people will say, well, this is a borderline case of reproduction. And because of that, the notion of what counts as a parent and offspring is not as clear as the other cases. So here we have a lineage of virus or retrovirus that reproduce or replicate indirectly. And parent and offspring, they have different material origins. The matter from which each virus is made is different. There is no material overlap. So now a third case. So I'm telling you these cases, and I'll go back to it. I'll show how it connects to the discussion of natural selection. So this is a case. Now the third and last case is about how different lineages can associate, how can relate to each other. So this is a case coming from New Zealand where we have some seabird species, they produce nests. And those nests are, of course, really important for secure a shelter against predation and increase the likelihood that the eggs the offsprings produced will survive, etc. But these nests are also very good for a species of reptiles. So reptiles will occupy and maintain those nests. They will cohabit those nests with the birds. So, and the reason, there are a few reasons why this is the case. One reason is because the temperature inside the nest is high. So this is a great way for reptiles to keep themselves warm, right? But the point being is that birds create the nests, they occupy the nests with the reptiles, but then the birds leave during the migration season. And the reptiles they will stay there, occupying and maintaining the nests. For example, the reptiles in the evenings, they will go out and they will make sure there is no, they will guard the nest against predators as well. So the nests will be preserved, and later on, birds will come back. So the nest is reoccupied and cohabit by bird and tuatara and the reptile. So this is a case, this is a very interesting case for several reasons. One reason is because here we see a type of inheritance, a type of trait transmission that is different from all the previous cases. So when I talk about lineages before, I was saying that the parent transmits its traits to the offspring, meaning that there are some physiological, some genetic, some behavioral characteristic that is being passed on. But also in this case, we see that lineages also pass ecological traits to their offspring. For instance, when the birds create the nests and those nests are preserved, the offspring of the birds will also enjoy those nests, and they will be able to get the same advantage out of the nest that the parents had. So there is an ecological transmission here rather than solely a biological transmission, right? And this transmission gives advantage to the next generation. So it helps the next generation to keep going, keep persisting. So a second important point in this example is that here we don't have, we have different lineages. So here we have birds, here we have reptiles, and here we have the nests that are themselves things that persist over time. So these three components, they form a complex association that co-evolves over time, but it's not a lineage. So here we have a complex association of different lineages, right? That are evolving, but it is a border is a case where it's not clear that this in itself, the association itself, is not a lineage, right? It is a complex of different lineages that is evolving. So summary of the cases. Now I will start moving the talk to use the cases in order to prove my points. So the first case, Aspen Grove, I said that we have lineages or something that resembles a lineage that is composed of genetically identical trees, but that are interconnected. And this borderline case of a lineage is something that can be selected, not just evolve, but be actually selected, just like an interactor or an individual, right? So the second case of retrovirus, we have also a marginal case of lineage because we have parent and offspring that are so indirectly connected that one might say that there are actually not, there is no material connection between them, right? There is a physical indirect connection, but there is no physical matter being overlapped that both possess, right? The third case is a case where we have a complex association of lineages that are evolved. So now I will tell you why these cases matter. They matter because they suggest that we should keep those notions apart. What is a lineage is one thing, and what is a unit of evolution is a different thing. So to remind you, a unit of evolution is an entity that changes in principle indefinitely over a large scale of time as a result of selection or other evolutionary processes that are occurring in the things that compose that unit. And the traditional view, as I have shown to you, like different traditional definitions of selection say that lineages are the entities that function as units of evolution. And the examples that I gave were these two examples of mammalian reproduction and bacterial replication. Now, the borderline cases, I would say that these are borderline cases of lineages, but nonetheless, they seem very well clear cases of what a unit of evolution is like. So these cases will challenge a few ideas that I mentioned before of what is a lineage. But nonetheless, those cases show that in each of those cases, there is something that is evolving over time. But whatever is evolving over time is not a completely discrete parent-offspring sequence, because reproduction is messy, is not a clear-cut case, right? As we see in the Aspen Grove case and retrovirus, reproduction isn't clear, so we might not have a discrete parent-offspring sequence, but nonetheless, we have something that is evolving over time. Also, we should challenge the idea that a parent causally and directly influences the material origin of its offspring. So there is a causal connection over time. As we see in the case of the retrovirus, there is a causal connection, but it doesn't mean that this influence has to involve matter. It doesn't mean that this influence has to be direct, right? This connection can involve different degrees of reliance on external factors. Finally, parent causally influence the traits of the offspring. Yes, they do. But traits here can be understood not just in terms of the biological composition of the parent, but also in terms of the ecology that the parent leaves to the offspring. So these ideas in red, I will talk about the last one in a bit, but these ideas in red, they are ideas that have been assumed by traditional definitions of natural selection. But as we see, evolution by natural selection is much more complex, right? Maybe you don't want to say that these cases are cases of a lineage, but what I think we all should say is that these are cases of units of evolution nonetheless. So one important feature is that traits tend to reappear over generations. And this is a key idea that it's at the core of this idea of units of evolution. But the traits, as I said, are not just biological traits, they are also ecological traits. So what I'm doing here is not exactly denying this bullet points that I said, but I'm expanding those notions. I'm showing that evolution is more complex than this naive idea of a lineage is about. So if we want to retain this naive idea of lineage, what we should do is at least recognize that not all units of evolution are lineages. They are marginal cases or borderline cases of lineage. So lineage, the traditional idea is that lineage accumulate selective advantageous traits over time. What I'm proposing is that, well, we should stretch, we should take out the concept of lineage here because this is a narrow concept as it has been understood. We should understand here units of evolution as distinct from lineages. And there is something that all units of evolution must have. So here is my positive contribution is units of evolution must be first order Markov chains, a type of first order Markov chains. So here's what, in very broad strokes, what such chains are. They are systems subject to stochastic change. There must be some possible changes, alternative possible changes over time, non-deterministic, right, changes. And so the systems can assume various possible states over time, subsequently. And the important bit is that each state is causally dependent on the immediate previous one. So here's a characterization of this. We have a system changing in at least four stages, as you see, right? And for us to understand what's happening at a state 4, for example, the probability that the system will reach that state 4 is determined by the characteristics of the system in the state 3, so the immediately previous state. So there is a causal and probabilistic dependence between the states of a system over time. So we can modify this idea of Markov chain to say what is the minimal condition for something to evolve, for something to be a unit of evolution. So to be a unit of evolution, we need a system that is spatial temporally continuous. We must be talking about something that is exists through time and through space, right? Things like a human population, things like a bacteria, but also things like an aspen grove, a retrovirus, a complex lineage association. So the system, of course, is subject to stochastic change. For instance, mutations may arise, selection will happen, etc. And the probability of traits at a particular state depend on the state that comes rightly before it. So the probability of traits in S4 depends on S3, which depends on S2, etc. And this idea of this probabilistic characterization of dependence is important because it captures that key idea that evolution is happening when there is a correlation happening over time. And the correlation that is important is a correlation of traits, right? So we don't have to identify parents or offsprings because these relations are not clear. But nonetheless, there is a correlation between traits that keep reappearing or tend to keep reappearing over time. So I think this idea can be basically captured. That's what I hope. This is a work in progress. But I hope this idea can be captured by fleshing out this notion of Markov chain. Now, let me finish very briefly with why I think this type of analysis of units of evolution, lineages, natural selection, why this is interesting. So why my analysis in particular is interesting. So you see two groups of people here. On the left, you see the traditional scholars who have been debating natural selection for decades. And they are the proponents of versions of the two definitions of selection that I mentioned before. So the replicator approach, we have Dawkins, we have David Hull. The Lewontin's recipe, we have Richard Lewontin, we have Peter Godfrey Smith, etc. Lisa Lloyd with certain version. Now, on the right side, we have more recent scholars who are challenging those traditional definitions. They are proposing, they are revising what natural selection is in different directions. We have, as you all know, we have John Dupre arguing that selection is actually not about entities, but about processes. And we have, for example, people defending that selection doesn't even require reproduction. So this idea was firstly, was actually fleshed out by Mathieu Charbonneau in a paper that won a prize at PSA in 2014. And more recently, it was also pushed by Francois Papal. And the idea here is that if there is no reproduction, there is also no lineages required. There is no parent-offspring. We don't need parent-offspring because we don't need reproduction. This idea sounds really radical when we compare to the traditional definitions of selection, because those traditional definitions, they also say that things have to generate more of themselves. There must be some replication, some copy making. Well, I think when we distinguish, as I did, lineages from units of evolution, we can better understand in which ways this proposal is really radical or not. So in other words, with the distinction that I'm proposing, I think we can really better compare the traditional definitions of selection with more recent ones. So for instance, even though Charbonneau and Papal argued that selection doesn't require reproduction, they say that, and there is a typo here, I'm sorry. They say that selection requires something like a memory. So what they call memory is a correlation between successive states in a population. So there is a correlation between the traits from the past and traits in the future. So by stating this memory condition, they are basically replacing reproduction with by this condition. What they are doing is actually saying that, okay, there are no lineages, but there are units of evolution. There is a correlation of something that is evolving. So they retain the core idea of units of evolution while they discharge the notion of lineage. So I'm sympathetic with, I'm defending this point, and I think that making a clear conceptual distinction between these two concepts actually make their work and our work clear. Now, the last benefit, well, a second benefit of my views, of my analysis here, is going back to microbes. So as I said in the beginning, one motivation for debating natural selection is what's happening in our guts, in microbial communities. So those communities are tight. They are composed of a bunch of bacteria that are displaying complex behavior, which seems to be similar to how organisms evolve under natural selection. So those communities seem to be organism-like. But nonetheless, it's hard to make sense of how they can reproduce and how they can transmit traits. Well, I think that the distinction that I proposed help us to look for other areas. It helped us to pose other questions to actually understand the evolution of these communities. So philosophers have, when they debate the evolution of these communities, they often, and here I could see a series of philosophers like Peter Godfrey Smith, like Mark Reshevsky, who ask the question, do communities form lineages? For them, this is a key question. This is a test to see if communities, how they evolve, is asking whether they form lineages. Well, what I'm proposing is a different angle to look for, is ask whether communities form units of evolution. So again, not all units of evolution have to be lineages. So this is a broader concept. And by asking this slightly different question, right, we can ask, for example, not just whether communities transmit biological traits, but also whether it transmits ecological traits, just as the case of the New Zealand seabird and reptile. Similarly, we can also ask questions such as whether what is the material relation between these communities? Perhaps, just like similar to a virus, the community has a different material origin. So the parent, what seems to be a parent and offspring, they have different material origins, but they have a similar form or template. So there is a basic type of information that is being retained. So these types of questions, I think, are overlooked when we, because we assume this narrow notion of lineage instead of accepting a broader notion of units of evolution. So conclusion, I defended this distinction, lineage and units of evolution. I tried to propose as an initial step of a positive suggestion that units of evolution are at least minimally a type of first order Markov chain. And then I just provided briefly some benefits that perhaps this analysis can have. As I said, this is a pretty much work in progress, and I'm looking forward to talk to you. So, muito obrigado mesmo. Now I probably should stop sharing the screen, or?
Yeah, you can do if you, well, wait a minute, let me just stop this recording. There we go.